Chapter 30. Goodbye, Sevkaya. My mother proved troublesome in Istanbul. She soon left Badia's house and took a room for herself in a tall old house in Shishli, saying she preferred to be alone. Sometimes she would visit my grandmother, and she and Bedia soon noticed her rapid deterioration, the carelessness of her dress. She told people that her children did not want her. She started to go without food, give most of her money to poor people whom she met in the streets. She would talk to all the beggars of Istanbul, inviting them to her room in Shishli, where she would give them quantities of food to take away. She could not bear to see people in tattered clothes and started to give them her own. At other times she would walk miles in the course of a day, returning home weary and hungry, but without money left to buy food for herself. She used to go to the old places where she had lived before, frequently taking taxis, haughtily telling drivers to wait for her, and then, when she could not pay them, would direct them back to Bedia's house. She bought quantities of sweets to distribute to the slum children, and once she was discovered sitting in the rank, overgrown garden of our ruined house, the house my father had bought for her before he went to the war. I could not get her to leave Istanbul, and could only write frantic letters imploring her to return to Bedia and my grandmother, where she would be well looked after. These letters she completely ignored. From the time she left Izmir, she never communicated with me, even indirectly through my grandmother's scrappy letters. I grew despairing, wondering what would be the end of this bad business. On February the 2nd, 1940, I received a telegram from Bedia asking me to go to Istanbul immediately, as my mother was seriously ill. I went to the commanding officer and showed him the telegram. He took one look at my face and gave me permission to leave the aerodrome. I left Bedia's address with him and hastily booked a seat by train to Bandirma. From Bandirma, I took the boat for Galata, impatient of the slow-seeming journey, my heart continuously in my mouth. When I arrived finally at Mehmet's house, Bedia's tear-stained, swollen face did nothing to reassure me that all, after all, may be well. "Is my mother dead?" I asked her, clutching her arm, and my grandmother came through the narrow hall and drew me into the salon. She seated herself and bade me to do the same, but this I was totally incapable of doing. "Tell me," I said to her quiet face, "is she dead?" "No," she said. "Better by far that she were." I walked up and down the room, seeing the familiar furniture that still could remind me of my childhood and hunger, even though I had nothing to fear on that score nowadays. All the houses we had lived in, even when prosperity had come back to us, were linked with those early insecure years, because the heavy old furniture was always there to remind one. There was never any escape from memories. "Come sit down," said my grandmother gently. "There's nothing to be gained by walking up and down the room or by hysteria." I sat on a brocaded chair, once beautiful, but now fraying at the edges through long usage. "Where is my mother?" I asked. "What has happened to her?" And I think I knew the answer before anyone replied. It was Bedia who told me, Bedia who started to cry and irritated me with her persistent tears, yet who had the courage to say what was difficult for my grandmother to say. "She has lost her mind," said Bedia, with a dignity in her voice, and I was glad that she were here, new to the family, able to speak of hurting, hidden things as we others would not have done, so new to the family that our horror could not touch her too much. My grandmother stood up very erect, her face without colour, and her stern eyes filled with compassion. She put a hand on Bedia's young shoulder and said, "There, my child, there's no need to cry." And she went on patting the thin shoulder absently, her eyes looking to something we could not see. And I leaned against the window, my body light as water, and waited for them to tell me everything. It was Bedia who was the storyteller. "Mother came to visit us 2 nights ago," she said, "and she looked very ill. She said she was hungry and I gave her something to eat, and then she asked if she might spend the night with us. She complained that her head ached, and of course I said I should be glad if she stayed with us, not only for one night, but for always. For a while she was all right, and then she began to get irritable and would not have the radio on, saying that it made her head worse, so I turned it off. When I had done what she remarked on how obedient I was, and asked me if I did not find it difficult living with grandmother. I said no, did not. She grew quarrelsome and said that grandmother was a most difficult woman, that all mothers-in-law ruined their daughter-in-law's lives, and that was the reason she would not live with me. She said she wanted me to be free of older people's influence, then turned to my grandmother and said she ought to leave me and take a room by herself somewhere. You are foolish to remain here, she said. Bedia does not want you. When one is old, one is useless, she continued. Children do not want one anymore. Bedia paused uncertainly, and I was aware of my grandmother's still immobile face from the shadows of her winged chair, of her contemplative hands demurely folded on her lap. Bedia went on. Mother started to get angry because grandmother would not answer her. She seemed to direct all her talk to her. She was really only using me as an excuse. I could see that. Then she told me that she hated grandmother, and that she had hated her for many years and was responsible for a house that was burned a long time ago, I think, added Bedia apologetically. Not yet being familiar with family history, not knowing of the square white house that had burned to the night skies. Mehmet is in Bandirma. He went there by torpedo boat a few days ago, so he was not here for all this. Mother kept asking for him and kept forgetting that I had told her where he was. Then she burst out that she could not understand what I was doing in her son's house. I know you are his wife, she said, but with an awful contempt in her voice. But I do not like your painted mouth. Nobody in this family ever used paint on their mouths. Then she told grandmother that she would cure her deafness for her and asked me to fetch her some olive oil. She said she would heat it and pour it into the bad ears. I did not want to do it, but she insisted, so I went to the kitchen and got what she asked for. When I came back, she was looking at a knife that was still on the table and which she had not used when she was eating. Here, Bedia shuddered, in remembrance, her eyes going dark, and she said in an odd sort of voice that the knife had a lovely edge, that it was so clean and shining, and she looked at grandmother all the time she spoke, but grandmother only watched her, not having heard anything she had said. I took the knife from mother and put it away, and when I turned back to her, she said, But is it wrong of me to admire the way you keep your cutlery, Bedia? Do you think perhaps I was going to injure grandmother? I said no. I had not thought that, and then she came over to me, and I screamed, and she looked surprised and asked why I did that, and I did not know what to say. And all the time, grandmother sat there not saying a word, not interfering, making mother more and more angry, and I was terrified of what was going to happen. She added naively, Grandmother is very obstinate, you know. I nodded, remembering that obstinacy from other years. Yes, I know, I said to Bedia. Go on. There isn't very much more to tell, she said. After a while, mother said that she would go to bed, that she could not bear the aching of her head, and asked me if I had any aspirins. I had not, so she said it did not matter. When she had gone to her room, grandmother suggested that we should get a doctor for her. I asked why, and grandmother said that she knew her daughter-in-law very well, that she had given trouble for years, and that in the mood she was in tonight, she was capable of doing a lot of troublesome things. Anyway, I went to get a doctor, and he came straight here with me, wondering what was wrong, for really I had been unable to explain very much to him. When he went to her room, she was still awake and asked me who he was. I told her that he was a doctor, that he would give her something for her headache. She seemed very suspicious of him, but allowed him to examine her and leave some tablets, and then he came to the salon with me and began to ask grandmother all sorts of questions about mother. Finally, he said that it would be better if she were put into an institution for a few months, where she could get good nursing and good food. She looks as if she has been starving herself, he said. Then he left us, but we had not realized mother had heard everything that had been said. You see, the doctor had had to shout to make grandmother understand him, and she had shouted back at him without knowing that she was shouting. It was terrible. Mother came back into the salon in her nightdress and said, "Do you think I am mad that you want to put me away where I shall never see my children again?" Grandmother tried to pacify her, although Mother was very quiet but upset too, and she sat down on the divan and looked at me pitifully. "Bedia," she said, "do you think that I am mad? Is it madness to want to help the poor, to love my children too much, to fear for my eldest son's death? Is it madness to live alone so that I shall not be a burden to the married happiness of you and Mehmet and Moazes and her husband?" And I said, "No, I did not think so." She sounded so terribly sane, and I began to think we had done the wrong thing by calling a doctor to her and by telling him so much afterwards. Mother sat there, and then she burst into tears and ran back into her room, where she locked the door. I ran after her, but she would not let me in, and I could hear her moving about all the time, crying. Then Grandmother came and banged on the door and roared out to her to open it for us. But her voice seemed to set Mother crazy. She suddenly flung open the door. She was already dressed, and she pushed us out of her way, saying to Grandmother, "You are responsible for everything that has ever happened to me." Then she flew down the stairs and out of the house. I ran after her immediately, but I could not catch her. She seemed to have the strength of 10 people. We heard afterwards that she had run almost to Shishle and had called a taxi, but when she was getting into the taxi she had fainted. She was weak, of course, for she had not eaten anything for days, only the small amount I had given her that evening. The taxi driver took her straight to medical jurisprudence. The police came to tell us so this morning. They said she had screamed at them in the police station and had fought to get away. They had called the doctor and he had given her injections and then sent her in an ambulance to jurisprudence. Betty had stopped speaking, and I looked at her, not yet 18, to have seen so much passion unleashed, to have witnessed the outbreak of the sores that had rankled for 26 years. And I thought that she had emerged from it all with the little touching look of youth gone from her face forever. Her little fragile air vanished like snow before the wind. "Where is she now?" I asked. "Did not know," replied Betty wearily. "The police will tell you. I would have gone myself to ask, but I was waiting for you to come." My grandmother laid a hand on my shoulder, and I thought of the listening, straining face that must have watched my mother, the closed ears that had heard nothing, even though she must have been aware of danger. I thought of the indomitable courage that had held her in her chair in the face of the bright, sure blade of the knife, when one unguarded movement might have incited my overwrought mother to use it on her. My heart turned over and I felt my skin begin to creep. Of the pain and the heartbreak and the jealousy of the long years, of the teeming, crowded brain of my mother, I would not let myself think. Not just yet. Not yet. Time enough to think of that later on. If you think of these things now, you will hate Betty and your grandmother for not having understood. Think of something else. I went to medical jurisprudence, and the doctor who had admitted my mother granted me an interview. He was an old, white-haired man with kind eyes, and when I asked him if I could see my mother, he said gently, "She is not here anymore. You are a young man and an airman, and you have witnessed many tragic things. It would not be right to subject yourself to such torture." I pleaded with him, but he was firm. "She is not here," he repeated. "We have sent her to Badakoy. She will be well looked after there." I remembered the red, windowless ambulance that had just driven off as I had arrived at jurisprudence, and suddenly I knew it had held my mother. They had boxed her up in that airless place to make sure the already unstable brain would crack. I felt the sweat break out coldly on my forehead. Was there no humanity anywhere? Was it necessary to treat her like a possessed, witless creature who had no feelings, who knew nothing? I knew as surely as if she had been speaking to me that she was perfectly aware of what was going on, that she had known why they put her in the windowless ambulance. How her own heart had always been wrung with pity whenever she had caught sight of these ambulances in Istanbul. "Poor things," she had said. "They are unwanted by their families. They are being taken to Badakoy, where they will not be allowed to give anybody any trouble." I could not rest until I had tried once again to see her. to comfort her if she could still be comforted. I left medical jurisprudence and got a train for Badajoz, fretting at the long wait at in-between stations, cross because I had not taken a taxi for the whole journey. I managed to get a phaeton at the station and was driven to the mental home, a grim building enclosed in lovely gardens and high, unscalable walls all around it. I walked in through the gates after a porter had sharply inquired my business. He looked at me suspiciously, and but for the fact that I was in uniform, I do not think he would have admitted me at all. A man came towards me, a perfectly normal-looking man, and I asked him where I could find a duty doctor. He grinned at me and made vague gestures with his hands, and I looked at his luminous eyes and passed on. I could not control a little shiver of apprehension. I went up some steps, and inside in a hall I saw a door marked Private Secretary. I went in and stated my business. When did she arrive? The secretary asked, fussily, thumbing through a sort of ledger. Today, I said, risking the shot in the dark, and he looked in a file and on his desk and said, Yes, she has been admitted that morning. He directed me to an opposite building for further details. He spread his large white hands, indicating that he was only the secretary, he could not know everything. I went out into the hall again and found that it was full of patients with their sleeves rolled up, all waiting for injections. I passed through their tidy ranks feeling horror if I had to touch them, perhaps half afraid of them. They looked at me incuriously, and I passed through their lines quickly, my head bent, embarrassment uppermost in my alienability to them. In the other building, I found a doctor who informed me that on no account would I be permitted to see my mother. Come back in 6 weeks' time, he said thoughtlessly. Perhaps you can see her then. Beaten by his obduracy, I asked if she could be moved into a private room, and he shrugged, intimating that the treatment afforded her there would be no better. She will feel more private there, I said. She will not be all the time aware of the other patients around her. Coldly, his eyes raked me. Lieutenant, he said with terrible hardness, terrible lack of understanding, she is not in a condition to be yet aware of anything. I hated his cold, precise voice, but I insisted nevertheless that she should be moved into a private room. He arranged for this whilst I was there, accepting the cheque I handed him with a doubtful air, as though suspecting that it might not be valid. As he was writing out a receipt for me, he said, It is preferable to pay with money, Lieutenant. I wonder, would you be good enough to remember that the next time you come up? I did not reply, and he stood up, indicating that he was a busy man, that the interview was at an end. As he said goodbye, his white hand lay limply in mine. His eyes seared through me, so that I realized here was a man with a mission. That given half a chance, he would put me under observation too. I left Badajoz having accomplished very little. All the way back in the train, I speculated wildly as to what they would do with her. Would there be a window in her room to give her all the fresh air and sunlight that she loved? Would there be a view over the gardens, or would they keep her strapped down on the bed, helpless in the face of their sane ministrations? The tears were never far from my eyes. I did not return to Mehmet's house. There was nothing more to say, and I did not want to meet the questions in my grandmother's eyes, the compassion in Badia's. I returned to Izmir and threw my energies into work and waited for news. Mehmet wrote several times, but I did not bother to reply. What was there to say? I hated their continual harping on the subject of my mother. Could they not leave her alone now? I was glad to be living in the aerodrome, where companionship now assumed a precious quality. In March 1940, I was given permission to go to Istanbul and took passage in a boat from Galata Bridge. When I disembarked, I went straight to Badajoz, bypassing Mehmet and his family. I was eager to learn about my mother for myself, with no second-hand information to influence the mind. By great good luck, it was a visiting day when I arrived at the mental home. The lovely gardens were crowded with visitors and patients, and sometimes I had great difficulty in distinguishing one from the other. I stated my errand to a crisp-looking, hard-faced nurse, and she walked away from me. I hope she did not have the handling of my impatient, impetuous mother, otherwise her chances of recovery were nil. I waited in the gardens, feeling unequal to sitting tidily in the bare waiting hall. My heart almost choked me, and my stomach kept turning over and over in the most unimaginable way. Suddenly, I felt unequal to this, and wished I had waited until Mehmet had been free to accompany me. I felt foolish and full of insecurity as I hesitated on the springy, dry grass, and I looked about me at the patients and the visitors, and thought that one should have nerves of steel and the imagination of a brick wall to come here. There was a tall old man making an impassioned speech to a dim, elderly lady who might have been his wife. He talked at her without ceasing, scarcely seeming to pause for breath. His bony fingers wagged before her passive face. Occasionally, he would thump his chest with a massive, destructive gesture and let out a roar like an angry lion. A doctor halted by me, his distinguishing marks in all this mass of undoubtful humanity being a white coat and a stethoscope dangling from his pocket. "The old man is not really so bad as he looks," he said amusedly, to my disbelieving face. "We hope to have him completely well again in another 12 weeks. A young girl held court with her father and mother, who watched her with fond, anxious faces. "So, of course, I could not marry him," she was saying in a light, scornful voice. "I could only refuse him." She looked all around her, so pretty and young and witless, with her chestnut hair and large eyes. She caught sight of me and smiled entrancingly, pointing me out to her parents. "Look," she said, "that is my husband. Do you not think he is very good looking?" I pulled the doctor by the arm. Hurrying away across the lawns, I asked him about my mother. "Has she any chance of recovery?" I asked. And he paused for a moment, and I paused too, turning to face him. "Tell me," I said. "I should like to know." He replied, not looking at me, "She has very little chance. She became worse suddenly, and we have to keep her quiet with injections." I saw her in my mind's eye, knowing the place she was in, wanting to get away to freedom, becoming violent because they had thwarted her, kept her quiet with the injections. That would be ruthlessly, relentlessly shot into her. "We must have quietness here," I could hear them all saying. "This patient is not quite mad enough yet. She needs disciplining." The doctor was watching me now, reading perhaps many things from my face. He said gently, "She will die soon. You would not wish her here for perhaps many years, would you?" I thought of my grandmother and the words she had spoken that morning in Istanbul when Bedia had told me the awful truth. "Is she dead?" I had asked, and she had answered sternly, "Better if she were." But I could not face the thought of her death like this. She still represented all the things I had looked for in life, even though I had never found them in her. I started telling the doctor all the things I had thought to be forgotten, things from childhood that suddenly, for this brief illuminating second, stood out in high relief. I told him of my father's going away, of the fire, of poverty, of the years in an orphanage in Karakoy, of my mother's working in the sewing depot at Gulhane Parka, of the old hatred that persisted and magnified with the years between my mother and my grandmother. I spoke of the love that had tried to chain me, of the restraints imposed, and all the time the doctor listened, nodding now and then as if he were beginning to understand her better. Presently he left me, and I stood alone on the sunlit grass, trembling, glad to have spoken of these things to another person. I waited for my mother. Presently I saw her coming with two nurses, one on each side of her supporting her. Her high, querulous voice reached me across the space that separated us, and she tried in vain to rid herself of the encompassing arms of the sturdy nurses. My heart bled for her, and I thought it would have been better not to have come here, not to have seen her so defenseless. She stopped in front of me, and I said, "Mother," and I saw a weary, trapped look come into her eyes. She looked at me as if she did not recognize me. I said, "Don't you know me?" Then she said, "Oh, it is you, my eagle, my airman's son." but there was no emotion in her voice, nothing save haughtiness, the voice she would have used to a stranger. She pointed to a man and said, "He is our cook. Not a very good one, I'm afraid, but we could not get anyone else." I looked at the man she pointed to, a visitor, and she saw my look and added, "He is really far too distinguished to be a cook, but there you are." Her voice trailed off, and she turned away from me, ignoring me, and began to tremble with such frightful violence that the nurses had to lean her to a seat. I followed them, and when she was sitting down, I took one cold hand in mine and kissed it, but she did not pay any attention to the gesture. All the time she persisted in treating me like a stranger. After that first flicker of recognition in her eyes, she had withdrawn from me. She felt me watching her and turned her head to me, saying, "Once I had a son too, who was an airman like you. He broke my heart." The calmness of her voice was terrible. "Oh, mother," I said, trying not to weep for her and for myself too. "Don't you know me?" I asked. It was cruel to go on knocking at memory like that, but I could not help myself. She did not answer me, only commenced to hum a little nameless tune, an odd thin sound, and the shivers still spasmodically shook her frail body. I gave her some Turkish delight, and she ate it, and then asked, with incredible courtesy, if she could have some more, as her friends were too poor to buy any for themselves. I handed her the box, but her hands were too unsteady to hold it, so that it fell to the grass, spilling its contents, and the nurses stooped to pick it up. She turned away pettishly, refusing to speak to me any more, and all the time she trembled. Her body and legs and arms were wasted. Only skin and bone remained of her. She persisted in keeping herself turned from me, and presently one of the nurses said she would have to be taken back to her room. She was to be put to bed. She went away with them docilely, never looking to me, never turning her head backwards from the door as she went through, not caring that I stood there looking after her, not knowing who I was. I stood there for a long time, watching the dragging, bent, trembling figure of my mother, and I thought I should not come here again. Silently I said goodbye to her, and then she vanished from my sight. I felt the tears running unchecked down my cheeks. I wept for myself and for the young lover who had once imprinted herself on the memory, the day she bade my father goodbye in the gracious salon of a long dead house. I wept for the beauty who had flashed jewels and hospitality, who had brought poetry into a house in the back street of Bayezid. I wept for the pale young girl who had drudged untold hours in an army depot sewing coarse linen for soldiers. I wept for the middle-aged woman of the fugitive, persistent beauty who had worn a flower in her hair against my return from the aerodrome, who had once sparkled and shone like the noonday sun, and who had withered to dust inside the body of this bent, trembling old woman who knew no one. But I wept most of all for my mother. A light touch on the arm made me turn to see a nurse with a face of great gentleness, of compassion. She said, "We have put her to bed now. Would you like to see her room?" "No," I said. No, thank you. There is no need. I'm sure she is very comfortable." She did not say anything to this, and I asked, "Is there a window in the room?" Her eyes lit with that rare understanding that comes so seldom in the world. "Yes," she said. "She likes us to keep it open for her, and we bring her to the garden quite often. She loves the gardens, you know." "Yes," I said, and saw the gardens she had made in Istanbul, in Eskişehir, in Kütahya, and in Izmir, and I wondered if loving hands still tended them. "She had green fingers," I said, irrelevantly, and a friendly nurse smiled. "Well, goodbye, Lieutenant," she said. "Come again, won't you?" "No," I said, "I shall not come again. It's better not." And suddenly the face of the friendly nurse closed up and grew hard, unable to understand. She said tartly, "But you can help her so much, you know." I remembered that the doctor had said she would not live for long, that she would never get better, and I wondered at that terrible, ruthless sanity of the sane, at the stupidity that asked me to come back and see my mother, to force awareness of myself upon her when she did not want to be reminded, when her son was dead for her because once he had broken her heart. Such pitiless cruelty. I had thought was alien to the friendly nurse, but there was no way of explaining to that closed face that there was nothing more to be said between my mother and me, that both of us were gone from each other. My mother had travelled farther than we who stood here in the sunlight. She had gone to that world of soft illusions, where she was always a young girl, the world to which she had tried to escape when her home was burned, when she learned that her husband had died on a faraway road under a blinding sun. She had wanted to go there long ago, but always we held her back, called to her to stay with us, but now she no longer cared and could not have been persuaded to stay anymore. I turned away from the gardens. The same man still speechified impassionately. The same young girl haughtily told her parents that she could never marry, all of them living in their illusory world where hurt could not touch them. Their voices followed me to the high iron gates, and the porter opened them for me to pass through. I went out to the quiet country road. On the 18th of May of that eventful year of 1940, my mother died, but for me, she had been dead this many a day. I received a telegram the morning they were burying her, when it was too late to go to Istanbul and too late for anything else to be done by me. Alone of all her family, Mehmet saw her lowered into the grave outside the fortress walls of Istanbul. An imam read the Koran for her, and presently Mehmet was left alone with her for a little while, and he too had gone, leaving her with the sun and the kindly rain and the eternal nights to come. Later we erected a tombstone for her, and a low stone wall about the narrow grave. We put rose trees at her head and her feet, and her name was carved into the shining marble stone. Sevke Orga, we wrote, 1895-1940. Ruhuna Fatia, pray for her. And the name looked lonely there amongst all the nameless dead about her. Then we left her alone, a little outside the Istanbul that she had loved.